This is Kate Swoboda, creator of YourCourageousLife.com, director of the Courageous Living Coach certification at TeamCLCC.com, and author of the book, The Courage Habit, which is available at booksellers and at Amazon. The Your Courageous Life podcast is all about going after what you want and creating and living a more courageous, emotionally resilient life. Might drop a couple of F-bombs, so maybe don't listen with your kids in the backseat of the car. And here we go with today's episode. All right, I'm going to start off today's episode on how to create better relationships with a quote. Here it goes. On some level, it all comes down to feeling better versus actually getting better. Repressing information about ourselves or our friends, creating scapegoats as a way to avoid our problems, using shunning to unite a clique and create group identity, all of these make people feel better because it makes them feel superior. But the only way to truly get better is to face and deal with each other, to sit down and communicate. And that's from Sarah Schulman. Schulman is spelled S-C-H-U-L-M-A-N. So if we're going to talk about how to create better relationships, think of a few times when you've been talking with someone and you felt an uncomfortable feeling in your body, like something just felt off. And maybe you felt like they were arrogant because they kept interrupting you, or maybe you felt like they were talking about what was going on in their life so much you couldn't get a word in edgewise to share your own life updates. Maybe you felt like they were really negative or complaining or a downer, or perhaps they're somebody who feels really passionately about an issue or a topic, and when they really get to soapboxing, they take on this intense, argumentative tone, and if you ask them a question, they treat it like a debate. You know what that experience is like, right? You've probably had it a number of times. And if I was in a room with an audience and I asked the room how many people have had this experience, how many people have met this person, most people would raise their hands. And if I followed it up by saying, yeah, those people, they're really annoying, aren't they? They're so difficult. I would imagine that most people would nod their heads. Like, yeah, that's right. Yes, those people are so annoying, so difficult. And if I asked that same group of people, if I asked you right now, who here is interested in learning how to create better relationships? I'm also guessing, and by the way, I've done this before, significant portion of the audience would say, yeah, absolutely, raise their hands, all that good stuff. But if I ask the same group of people, great, now I'd like you to raise your hand if in those situations with those annoying, difficult people, you decided to ask them for what you need, the room would have a lot fewer hands raised. Maybe a few would still be up, but if I clarified what I mean further, I'm guessing some more hands would go down. So if I asked the audience, when you felt as if that person was always interrupting you, did you ever say to them, oh, wait, hold on, I want to finish what I'm saying here? Hands would go down. If I asked the audience, when someone was so busy talking about their own life updates, did you ever say to them, oh, wow, we've both been busy. Actually, I'm excited to catch you up on some things that have been happening with me. Hands would go down. If I asked the audience, hey, that person who is so negative and complaining, did you either ask them how you might support them, since clearly they're struggling if they're complaining so much, or did you ask for a topic change? Hands would go down. And if I asked the audience, hey, that person who is really passionate and debating for their position, did you ever say something to them like, I want to keep talking about this, but this is feeling really intense for me? Again, hands in the audience would go down. So in essence, generally speaking, people are all about saying, I want to create better relationships, until it means doing something difficult, something that requires courage, which is speaking into and negotiating what you need in your relationships. I mean, let's flip it around. No one likes to imagine this of themselves, but what if you were the one who was interrupting a lot? And maybe you didn't even notice it, but a friend to themselves decides, God, I've just had enough. I'm over it with you interrupting. And she stops taking your phone calls or making plans with you. And you have no idea that this isn't why she's making plans, and you're left wondering, how does that feel? Or let's say that you're really excited about some big life changes and you're yammering on about them and you mean no harm, but yammer away you go. And your friend decides, or someone you're talking to in the office, or etc., they decide, oh my God, this person's so full of themselves. And one day they angrily tell you this. And you had no idea that they were upset. For you, this anger is coming out of nowhere. How does that feel? Or maybe you're really struggling and it's really difficult for you to see the positive in life right now. And someone at a party talks with you for a few minutes, decides you're too negative, and excuses themselves to go get a drink. And then standing there with a few other people nearby, the person says to the group, oh, don't talk to that person over there. My God, they're so negative. How would that feel? Or perhaps you feel passionately about a particular issue, and usually underneath that kind of passion, there's actually at least a little bit of fear, like a passion and intensity that arises because you're afraid the issue won't change and you really, really want it to change. And maybe when someone asks you questions without intending this, those questions just somehow feel like the pushback that those who are opposed to your issue might give you. And your voice takes on a force as you try to advocate for why you've really thought through the changes that are needed. And the intensity in your voice had nothing to do with the person asking the questions. It was just you, and you're getting worked up over something you care about. And, later you think to yourself, maybe I went a bit overboard, and you say as much to the person and they kind of, oh gosh, no big deal. That's what they tell you. But then they call less and don't make plans and don't seem to really want to maintain the relationship. And they've decided you're too annoying because you soapbox. And you have no idea that that's why they are suddenly unavailable, though. How do you feel? And my guess is that in any of these scenarios, you'd feel pretty awful or embarrassed, or that you'd say things to yourself like, what did I do wrong? Or you'd be racking your brain trying to figure out what in the world happened. And let me just throw out one more hypothetical that will form something of the basis for the other things I'll talk about in today's podcast on creating better relationships. For those of you who are parents, or those of you who have a niece or a nephew that you adore, let's say that your kid is the one who's interrupting or talking too much, etc., whatever it might be. And so their friend group at school, without even talking to them about what was bothering them, throws them out of the group, shuns them, talks about them to other people, stops inviting your kid to things that everybody else is invited to. Would you be okay with that? Would that feel good to you? So I started with the examples of how it feels when other people have certain behaviors that we don't like. And I'm pointing out that much of the time, most people don't speak up when other people exude behaviors that we don't like. Most of the time, what people do is just talk about it to somebody else and ghost, or just kind of like let the communication fall off. But if we turn the example around and entertain the possibility, what if you were doing any of these behaviors unbeknownst to you, and someone judged you for it and then didn't want to be around you, then what? Or your kids, then what? Is this the world you want to live in? Is this how you want connection to look? So I'd like to point out a few things that are obvious, but that not everyone actually puts into practice when they want to create better relationships. And as you're listening to these, I'd like you to imagine the person you have the most conflict with, someone you wish you could have a better relationship with, or at least have less conflict with. It could be a coworker, family member, a friend you haven't been vibing with for a while. And if you're someone who would raise your hand and say, yes, I want to create better relationships in my life, I want to experience less conflict, then I'm hoping that you'll be willing to examine each of these areas. So as I'm going through each one, have your person that you'd like less conflict with in mind. So first, having this person in mind, will you acknowledge that it is human for them to make mistakes, to be imperfect, to not have all the perfect skills of communication and interaction and relationships nailed down? Now, I could totally see someone saying, well, I mean, if someone doesn't want to annoy other people, they need to make sure they don't interrupt. They never yammer on about themselves, complain, talk about negative stuff, talk about issues that are really important to them without being able to read the room. I mean, God, read the room, like I don't do those things. Well, to that person, I'd say, congratulations on being perfect and so much better than all the rest of us. But for the rest of us humans, can we all just admit that sometimes we interrupt or get caught in cycles of negativity, or in essence do things wrong with one another, and that it is human to make mistakes, to be imperfect? It's part of being human to mess these things up. And at least for me, and check in and see if this is true for yourself as well. When I reflect on the times when I've been the worst offender in any of these areas, I can always trace it back to a mistake on my part of thinking that I was connecting without realizing that I was being alienating. So maybe I was interrupting, but I was thinking that the conversation was just flowing along and had no idea that I was being an annoying interrupter. I mean, consider, for instance, that some people say that they know they're close to another person because they can, quote, finish each other's sentences. It happens. People are imperfect, for crying out loud. People are imperfect. This is what I want to say so often, especially when I see things going on social media and y'all, we're gonna mess it up. Can we give one another some grace? Can you give the annoying, difficult person in your life some grace and see if that creates a better relationship? I am not talking about excusing abusive behavior. Critical thinking, please, everyone. Of course, I'm not talking about excusing abusive behavior. But annoying interruption behavior is not abusive. It's just annoying. So can you give the annoying, difficult person in your life some grace? Second thing, maybe you're thinking, oh, so you're saying we just should all hold hands in a circle and be besties. And I don't think that's going to work for me, Kate. Well, good. I'm not saying that either. You don't have to be friends with everyone, and not everyone is for us. But if other people's behavior bothers you and you are writing people off and never communicating your needs to the person to give them a chance to take in that feedback and respond, how can you even really say you know who they are? Isn't part of who we are embedded in how we respond to our interactions with others? What if you communicated what you needed and the person realized something about themselves and decided to do it differently? Now, this is not to say that because you make a request in a relationship, someone else has to honor it, and that's what constitutes a good friend. But it is to say that if you write someone off without having a conversation about what you need or finding out what their motivations are for the behaviors that annoy you, then you have no real idea who the person is or what they or your relationship is really capable of becoming. And people have different ideas about what it means to be in relationship. There are some people who have this idea that if they call you or they send you an email or a text and you don't respond within 24 hours, that you don't care about them. And there are other people who are like, yeah, I can chat with you once every couple of months and I'm good. And I just kind of drop in and it's just as if we talk every day. And it doesn't mean that either way is right or wrong. But people have different ideas about what these things mean. And I have watched, sometimes been embroiled in, people getting so upset that how the number of times, the quantity of responses or times when I would reach out differed from the quantity or responses of times they reached out. And what they made it mean was that I was not putting effort into the relationship, or, and I've done it too before too. I mean, if I'm completely honest, I could search around, I could see that. And it's this entire narrative that is made up in our heads because actually there is no rule book written up in the clouds that says, this is how many times you have to be in connection with someone for it to be considered a true relationship. There's no rule book anywhere. Two people are making it up as they go along. So if you write someone off without having a conversation about what you need or finding out what's going on with them, you honestly have no real idea of who the person is or what they or your relationship can become. And I hate to say this, but with that behavior of writing someone off without the conversation, you're simply judging people. And constant judging of other people means you're being a judgmental person. And I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning consciously wanting to do that. We get self-righteous. We want to be right. We want to be the wronged party because we're hurting, because we wish someone else would be different so that we could connect. And then the paradox is that we do things that don't actually create the connection we want. It doesn't create better relationships to write someone off without a conversation. And if someone else wrote you off and never gave you an opportunity to talk about what you need or to negotiate aspects of the relationship, then they're judging you. And this is profoundly anti-relational. So thinking of this person with whom you've had conflict, are you committed to being relational with others? Are you committed to being compassionate and non-judgmental as often and as much as you can? You might not do it perfectly, but are you committed to doing it as much and as often as you can? Because there is a big difference between deciding that a relationship is not a match because it just isn't gelling for you, you aren't feeling resonance, etc., and quietly judging someone until you reach a breaking point and then you cut off without ever having a conversation. These conversations require courage, and your willingness to have the conversation reflects your current way of being. The last thing I'll say about creating better relationships is that we create better relationships through the ability to rumble with and navigate diversity, not being homogenous. And often this is the bitter pill to swallow, I think, for myself and everyone. The things that annoy us in others are things that need examination in some way in our own lives. Oh, the number of times I've had that realization, often kicking and screaming. So, for instance, what I mean by that the things that annoy us often can be things that need examination in some way for ourselves. The person who interrupts, they're annoying you, perhaps because you don't feel permission to take up space with your opinions in conversations. Now, I'm not diagnosing you somehow. If you're like, no, this interrupter person, they're really annoying and I don't have that issue. Okay, cool. But it's worth looking at. Why does it bug you so much? You know, sometimes the person who's talking about their life is annoying to other people because they feel insecure because they don't have a lot going on in their own life. Or sometimes the person who's negative or complaining bothers you because on some level you understand that they're suffering and that's why they're negative and complaining. And you are also suffering in some similar way, but you do not want to look at those places in your life, or you'd be embarrassed to talk openly about those issues. And so this other person's over here just talking about it openly. It feels very triggering. And sometimes the person who is so passionate about an issue triggers you because you feel a kind of latent guilt that you aren't doing anything about that issue. And so you feel out of integrity with yourself. And instead of making them wrong for being so passionate, Perhaps what you could do is go, why does it bother me so much that this person is so intense about this issue? Like, what are they realistically doing to me that they're intense about this issue? Okay. Actually, I see how intense they are about this issue, and I go, oh, I'm not really doing a lot in that area, and I feel kind of guilty about it. Now, again, not diagnosing anyone, maybe none of those examples landed for you, but it's worth looking at. Because diverse viewpoints, diverse ways of being create more opportunities for critical thinking, or for understanding others' motivations, or for humanizing other people. And for everybody listening to this, I mean, you want to be a critical thinker, right? You want to understand other people's motivations. Didn't say you always have to agree, but you want to at least understand other people's motivations as part of being like a human being on the planet, right? You don't just think the only motivations to understand are your own, right? You want to humanize other people, right? You don't want to be dehumanizing, right? So this is why it's worth looking at this diversity of ways of being. It's a sign of maturity if you can handle someone else's way of being different than your own. It's a sign of immaturity when a person can't tolerate someone being different than the way they expect or want them to be. And maturity and immaturity, I am not using those terms as judgments. I'm just simply saying it is a more developed approach to be able to say, yeah, their way of being or their expectation about how conversational interruptions happen or the way they handle difficult, stressful times, that's different than the way I do it, and that's okay. By the way, spoiler alert, in case you're kind of going, oh man, I'm not great at this. Hi, I'm Kate. I struggle with this. Most of us struggle with this because, of course, it would be easier to live in a world where everyone conformed to my expectations, right? Like, of course, that's what we kind of want by default, but that's not the world we live in. So we have a couple choices. We can either learn how to deal with the fact that other people are different and find ways to connect even with other people being different, or we can watch our social worlds collapse inward and become smaller and smaller until, frankly, they only include those few people who are willing to strain to pretend that they can always meet our needs. Because that's all someone's going to do if they sense that that's what you expect. They're going to pretend and they're going to strain, and eventually it doesn't work because no one can ever always meet our needs or always show up the way that we want them to show up. And then eventually we lose. So if we want to create better relationships, we need to acknowledge that it's not those annoying people over there. Oh my God, like I just need to get them out of my life. I'm just like so tired. They get canceled. Like we need to acknowledge that we are not perfect and neither is anyone else. We need to remember no one is a mind reader, which means that we have to communicate our needs and be willing to hear the needs of others. We need to consider diverse viewpoints. And sometimes, even if we bring up our needs, somebody else is going to have a different idea of how based on what their needs are, a different idea of how the relationship could go. So we need to be open to different ways of being and see how that often leads to our own growth, even if we initially really want to reject the discomfort and the messiness of being with someone else's way of being that is different than our own. And I really believe that this is the price of admission that we pay to be received by that same person when our views or our way of being is different than theirs. This is what it means to really hear one another. Don't you want other people to be willing to be uncomfortable and still be in relationship with you when your way of being is different than how they want to be? Most relationships are not destroyed because one person is bad and needs to be excised from your life, but because two parties, both, are not willing to really sit down and hear one another. And if we want to create better relationships, we have to start with examining whether our own behavior is relational. And it takes courage to be relational. It's not smooth. It often does not look cool. But I truly believe that when we write someone else off because they don't behave according to our liking, there's a part of us that writes ourselves off too, because we've just cut ourselves off from a potential opportunity to learn from others, to learn about the world. We've lost an opportunity to build our own character by going through the process of facing our own discomfort with another human being. If you write someone off without communicating, and of course, I mean communicating respectfully, right? Like not just walking into the room and saying, I don't like you, F off, and going, I communicated. No. I'm talking about actual communication 2 ways. If you write someone off without communicating, you're making assumptions, which means you aren't growing. You're just relying on your past beliefs about the world in order to function in the present. Or you're projecting into the future as if you can predict that. Failure to communicate means an assumption. Like, why do people fail to communicate? Because they assume that it's not going to result in what they're hoping for, which is an attachment to result, which is making an assumption about how it's going to go. And the assumption is based on our past belief about who that person is, or a projection into the future as if we can predict who that person is going to be. And I tell you, I want something better for our world than this divisiveness. I want something better for our world. I want us to practice these skills so that we can teach our children these skills. Because again, how do you want your kids to be treated by other people when they do very human, awkward, messy things? I want us to practice these skills so that our children don't experience, so that we can model it and our children see it and thus don't experience the pain of being excluded without explanation or communication. I want something better for our world than the online discussions that just so easily tip into full-blown warfare. I want something better for families that are torn apart by shunning and withdrawal and silence. It's painful. When does it stop? And I hope that you want something better too. So I hope that we'll all practice what I think is the most courageous thing we can practice, and that's having the courage to join together in reflecting on how we can create better relationships, starting with our own behavior and how we treat others. All right, that's today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. You know you can continue the work and the fun if you want to. Head on over to yourcourageouslife.com/begin and become a Your Courageous Life subscriber, because as soon as you sign up, you get access to an entire library of worksheets and audios and other bonuses. And of course, you'll be receiving more courage in your inbox. And who wouldn't love that? You can learn more about the Courageous Living Coach certification at teamclcc.com. You can get the Courage Habit at your local bookseller, on Amazon, wherever you like. We can even connect on social media. I'm on Facebook at Your Courageous Life. So look for facebook.com/Your Courageous Life. And I'm on Instagram as Kate Courageous. And I'd love to connect with you on Instagram. So here's to you, using these courageous tools in your life and creating a real ripple effect of good. And again, thanks so much for listening. I love it that you're here.